Hey everyone, my name is Shane Smythe. Welcome back to Salesforce Mojo. Today we're going to be going over commerce objects and fields, part 1. Because there's a lot of objects and a lot of groupings inside of Salesforce, we're specifically going to be going over store, products, and buyer, those groupings, and I'll talk more about what those groupings are in a moment. But if you're interested in the different objects and maybe you just want to go a little bit deeper on what do they do and how do they connect together, because we all know there's a ton of data in commerce. Stay tuned, we're going to be going through those at a high level, and they're actually going to be digging into an ERD that will really open up your eyes into how all this data is connected together and used in Commerce Cloud. So stay tuned, we're going to get right into it. So before we get too far into the content today, I wanted to start with just a high-level overview of the object structures that Commerce Cloud has inside of it. And you might have seen this content here before, and we're actually going to pull it up, the source of it, so you know where to get it. But you can see that there's a lot of categories here of different types of data. You have your storefront, you have your buyers, you have your checkout categories, you have catalog, entitlement policies. And as you're first getting into Commerce Cloud, it's overwhelming. There's dozens and dozens of objects. And so the objective for today is really to get a little bit further into the detail and explain how these objects are useful. If you're looking for the source of that image I just showed you, it's inside of the B2B and B2B2C commerce data model. Underneath the second module in here called Exploring the Salesforce Data Model, you can scroll down, you can see this image here, and it does break down the content into a little bit more of the components here, but it doesn't have all the detail in the world. And so that's what we're going to be doing today, is we're going to be classifying the objects into categories or groupings of them, and then we're going to dig into them individually. Okay, so where are we actually going to start with the data? Because there's a lot of these, there's dozens of objects. I've broken these down into different groupings. We're going to start with the store and all the objects around the store. We'll then move on to product, and from there we'll go on to buyers. The last three here are cart, promotions, and orders. And the 6 of these make up the majority of the grouping of data inside of Commerce Cloud. There's probably a couple that don't perfectly fit in here, and there's going to be a couple I don't also cover as well, but this is the majority of the data and structure that you need to know inside of Commerce Cloud. Now today we're going to be covering specifically store, product, and buyers and how those interrelate to each other. And then in a following episode we'll cover cart, promotion, and order together, because that's kind of the end of the life cycle here. Once we get the storefront working, then you need a cart and you want to add promotions and you eventually have that order. So that's how we're going to logically break it up. So for each one of these groupings, I'm going to start with a quick high-level overview slide like this, just to talk a little bit about the different objects we have in play here. And then what I'm going to do is actually dig in a little bit further into the data model, ERD, and then we'll actually go into Salesforce and we'll take a look at what the data actually looks like. Because I feel like that's a really good way to start to solidify the different types of information we have to deal with commerce. So inside of the store grouping here, we of course at the very top have our web store. And you can see on the left-hand side, we have the label that you will see within Salesforce. Then we have our API names, then we have our description. So store is actually web store behind the scenes. It represents your store entity. And you can have multiple stores. You may have a B2B store, you may have a D2C store, you may have multiple of both. So you can have more of these. Then you have your store catalog, which behind the scenes is your web store catalog. It represents all the products that are associated with your store. Then next we have a interesting object that is actually a little bit hard to find, but it's called a registered external service. And this registered external service is actually what you use to hook up new integrations, taxes, inventory, pricing, etc. But if you go into your object manager, you're not going to find that. This is really a behind the scenes object that you use in Workbench and other areas, so nothing that you actually will see in the UI. From there, you have your payment gateway and your payment gateway provider. Now these two objects together allow us to connect to an external service for actually placing payments, most prominently credit card. So if we're setting up a external service to Stripe to be able to accept a credit card, we will need a payment gateway and a payment gateway provider, which links the actual Apex class we have to make that call out back to the store. So now let's take a deeper dive into this, because this is really a high level of these objects, but there's a lot of objects and interconnections between these. So just to get us orientated here, I have a couple of different Lucidcharts that we'll actually go through as we progress through the series here. On the left-hand side, I have our diagram key, so you can see that each one of the categories or groupings that we talked about has a different color. So we're starting with store here, and you can see on the left-hand side, we have the store here. So this is where we're going to start. And this is a really high level ERD, so it doesn't have all the fields, but I put a couple on here that I thought would be helpful to facilitate this conversation. So I started with store, which is also web store. We have our catalog, and then we have a junction object between the two of them called store catalog, which actually connects the store to the catalog and vice versa. We also up top here have a couple other objects that I didn't mention in the overview, but I thought would be important here. You have this concept of a web store network and an actual network. And if you've been around Commerce Cloud or Community Cloud for a little while, you're probably familiar with what this actually is. But it's, again, an object that you're not going to see really in the object manager. But as you're setting up your store, what happens is it also creates a community, which behind the scenes is also referenced as a network. And this network is actually where all the community data is then nested off from here. So you can see that from our store to our network, we have a junction record connecting the two of them together so that you have your store and your community as one. Then if we go down to the bottom right-hand side, this is where we get into our integration services. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of show a little bit of a grouping within the grouping here. So within the store grouping that I've talked about, we have our integration services. And we talked about this registered external service and the gateways here. So you can see that we start with our payment gateway, which is hooked up to a name credential, which is actually where you'll have your authorization URL and your keys if that's necessary. And then we actually have our payment gateway provider, which is hooked up to an Apex class that actually has all that code. And then we have our registered external service, and what actually connects it into the store is the store integrated service. So now that we've kind of set the stage with the objects and some of the important fields, let's actually dig into Salesforce and go through some of these objects in there. So we're going to start at the very top here, so our store. And actually, when I logged in, it defaulted me into our store because that's the last place I was at. But if you go over into your app switcher or your object switcher over here, you can see that we can go into the stores object. And you can see we have a normal list view that shows all the stores that I have in this instance, which is 3. And when I click into it, it gives this kind of nice UI'd store experience here. But behind the scenes, this is just a record, and this record has fields on it just like every other object does in Salesforce. The next thing that we have from here is our catalog. So if we go back into our app switcher, I have our catalog already on the object switcher here. So if you click the catalog and go to all catalogs, you can see that we have one catalog per store. And if I were to go into this B2B LWR one, you can see that it takes us to kind of this catalog page, which again is a special page as part of Commerce Cloud. But if you use any of the Salesforce Inspector tools or other ways of getting at this, you can see that this object is called product catalog. And if we were to look at the data here, it is just a simple object. It provides a top level catalog that then you can nest all of your categories and catalog information off of that. So that's kind of that at a high level. Then the next thing we want to do here is we want to go over into our object manager just so I can show you that some of these objects aren't available here, but they are here. So if you go over into object manager and you type in registered external service, you'll notice that nothing actually shows up here. So let's switch over into Workbench, and Workbench is a little bit of a behind the scenes here. If you ever want to see some of the metadata or get some of the raw information, it's a really good tool to be able to see that. So you can go over into SQL queries here, and you can find registered external service. So that object does exist here, and you can pull over all of the fields, and you can see that we have multiple different registered external services. And you can see that in previous videos, we've done some work in Workbench and we've done some setup of some of the integrated services. And so you can see some of the LWR ones that we set up in those videos. And you can also see where it actually connects into the external service provider. So if I were to open this one up here, this record has this Apex class that we have integrated against. And so you can see how this kind of all starts to connect together and some of the data that fuels this integration. Now this registered external service is important, but there's also a couple other objects here that are related to this integration service capability that are available within Salesforce proper here. So if we go over into Payment Gateway, let's see if I can find that here. Yep, Payment Gateway, and I can click onto this, and you can see that my Payment Gateway is Stripe, and you can see that it connects to a merchant credential, which in the diagram I showed before, it said named credential, which in reality is exactly what this is. So if I were to click on this, it'll take me over to my named credential. They just relabeled it as merchant credential on the object. Okay, so now that we've covered the easy one, let's go into a little bit more of the depth here. We have product. Now, product is the beating heart of your store. Without products, why are people coming to your store? Well, they wouldn't. So there is a lot of information on here. I've listed, a handful of the main level objects, but as we start to get into the ERD, you'll notice that each one of these main things that we're listing here as one of the top level objects has a lot of objects around it to support the functionality. So let's start at the top. We have our product and our price book, which are product 2 and price book 2. This is the actual product you're selling and the price book that is connected to the store. Now, it's not actually where the price lives, and we'll talk about this in a moment. That's price book entry, but the price book is very important. We then have our price adjustment schedule, which allows us to specify pricing adjustments based on different attributes and tiers. We then go down into category. Categories are a pretty common and well-known term, but this gives you the ability to have some navigation capability to group things like shirts and pants together, or tractors and trucks together, or whatever you're actually selling. But at the end of the day, you have the ability to define what your categories are, and these categories can help set up your store. Then we have our entitlement policy, and the entitlement policy gives different buyers access to different products and being able to see those products and view prices. So a really important concept here with entitlement policy. We then have our product variation, and product variations allow us to have complex products. So you have your simple products, but then you can also have different pick lists of types of products as you're going into it. And we've seen several examples of that as we've gone and built these in the store, but there's a lot of data behind that. And then we have our quantity rules. Quantity rule is one of those videos I just did recently, but it gives you the ability to lock down how many people purchase and what the bare minimum is, etc. And then finally, product media. So images come into this so that people can actually see what they're purchasing with several images, attachments, and data sheets. So now that we've seen the high level here, let's go into the ERD. Okay, so you can see that we have a lot more objects this time around than we did last time. Let's zoom in just a little bit so we can focus on different areas here before we get too overwhelmed. But the very center of this, we have product. Product, like I said, is the beating heart of the storefront. It's really, really important, but you can see there's a lot of data around it to support it. So you have your main product, you have your ID, your name, your SKU, and this the 2 fields that I put on here probably is actually 20 or 30 or 40, depending on how complex your products are. But for simplicity's sake, I've just kept it to the main ones here, but you have a lot of standard and custom fields that help you support that. Then you have your price book, and this price book helps us actually identify the different types of prices that happen in Salesforce. You might have one for opportunities, you might have one for one store or another store, or different types of pricing for one store. So there's a lot of options there, and I'll show you in a moment here as we start to connect the pieces together how this helps you really price correctly. But then on the actual price book entry, this is where the actual price is, whether it's active, and you can see that we've connected product and price book together. Now the next thing that we actually need to go through is categories. So now we have product or a series of products. We want to be able to show this to the storefront. Well, you need a category. and you need a junction object to connect the product to the category. So let's hop over into Salesforce real quick, and let's open up one of our products so we can see this for real life. Why don't we go into our kitchen soap dispenser? And you can see that as we're on this record here, so this is the product to object that we just looked at, we have our price book entries. So it says price book, but these actually are the price books that it's associated with through the entry records. So you can see that we have 3 entry records here, all at the same price, all active. But then categories, as we were just talking about, you can see that we have our categories here, and this one product is associated to 3 categories. So behind the scenes here on the store, we have one record for each of these categories, but we have multiple products relating to the actual categories. So as we go back to our Lucid chart here, you may have one kitchen record here, but let's say you have 5 different products that you want to live in that kitchen category. You'd have 5 products here. You'd have 5 connections or product category product records that connect into one category. So if this is your first time kind of getting into Salesforce and junction objects and how the relationships work, that's kind of a good example of how you would structure the data that way. And the next thing down here is entitlements. Now we've talked quite a bit about entitlements over the course of this series here, but again, entitlements allow you to say what product you should be able to see as a specific buyer here. So we haven't started talking about buyers yet, so you can see that there's no connection into buyers. But if we go back into Salesforce here, you can see that if we go into entitlements, we have entitlement policies. Now, just a quick call it here, there is entitlements and there's entitlement policies. We're not talking about entitlements, we're talking about entitlement policies because those are what's commerce is all about here. So you can see we have an entitlement policy for the B2B LWR one. And if we hop in there, you can see that we have connected products and connected buyer groups. So if we go back over into our product, which was the kitchen soap dispenser, we have a related list over here that shows 2 different records that connect to 2 different entitlement policies. So again, just to talk more about this example here, we have one product, we have 2 entitlement policies that one product is associated with. So we have 2 different records right here that are connecting that one product to 2 different entitlements. So if we now had 2 products, we would be able to use the same entitlements but connect those different products to that same entitlement without having to duplicate those entitlements each time. That's how that data structure is set up and how it works. Now let's go down into product variations. Now, product variations, at least in my opinion, is one of the more confusing and complex attributes and objects inside of Salesforce, but this gives you the ability to have multiple different variations underneath a single product. So let's go into Salesforce because I feel like this is one of the ones that you need to see in order for it to make sense. You can see that we have a couple of simple products and you have a set right here. So I'm actually going to hop over into one of our other stores. And you can see in this store right here, we have one called Variation Parent. So the product class of Variation Parent is what utilizes this set of data right here. So if we hop into shirts and we go over into variation, you can see that we have multiple variations here. We have a shirt that's small, we have a shirt that's a medium. And these different records right here, if we click into them, are also products themselves. So we have multiple different products, and what connects the child product here, so the small and medium, to the parent product, and you can see that we have a variation parent detail over here, and it says that the shirts right here is the parent. So what connects these together, if we go back over into our ERD, are the product attributes, and these product attributes allow us to connect a variation to a product. But then we also need the ability to say, we want this variation or this product to have this attribute on it. So in our case here, we have shirts small right here. And this shirt small right here allows us to actually say what type of attribute it is. So if we go back over into commerce setup here, The easiest way to visualize this, in my opinion, is go into product variations, and you can go into variation sets. So in our instance, we have two different variation sets. We have our size color and we have size. So some of our products only need a size variation, which is the one we were just looking at. It's just small and medium. But other products have maybe a small blue and a small red. So they have multiple different variations. These are all driven off of custom fields associated with the attribute set. So that was a ton of information about variations very quickly, and maybe we'll do another deeper dive on this later on. But suffices to say that these objects right here allow us to connect the different attribute sets to the product variations to the product parents. Now let's keep going down. The next one down is the quantity rule. And I won't touch on this one too much because it's really straightforward and we just went over this, but you can create a quantity rule. So an increment max min that we just went through, and these quantity rules can connect to one or many products. So you could have multiple products that have the same quantity rule. And these objects are also available within Salesforce. You can see that I have an example right here with a minimum of 5, increment of 5. We only have one product associated to this quantity rule, but we could have more than one, and it allows us to scale this one rule, but connect it to multiple products. So continuing on, we have our pricing adjustment capability here. And again, you need to have multiple objects here in order for this to really connect back into your data structure. But we have our price adjustment schedule. So let's hop into Salesforce and see this. I believe I have one of these open, although I might have closed it. So let's go over into price adjustment schedules. So in this instance, I haven't set up any price adjustments. So I'm going to do that real quick as we go through it. So we're going to set up one schedule here. So let's just call this schedule 1. And we want this to be a range based on volume, and we're going to save this. And then we need to set up tiers. And we could have one or many tiers. So let's say the bottom is 5 and the top is 100. And this is a tier type of a flat discount off of $100. And we can save this. And now that we have this price adjustment schedule, we also just created a price adjustment tier. So we just created these two objects right here, two records inside those objects right here. But then once we've done that, we actually need to connect that adjustment to a price book entry, which in turn is relating it to a product because we're going to the product back through that. So if we go back over into Salesforce, you can see that you can't do it down here, but if you click the price adjustment entries up here, you can actually find your product. So let's say sync, or actually we need to do a price book, so we can do LWR, and I want to do this B2B commerce one, and I want to actually find the product after that, so I want to do my drop-in sync right here and finish. So now we've associated the price book and the price book entry to the product, and that gives us a connection all the way back here. So now the next thing down is our media. Now media is a little more complex because it has a couple of weird objects, in my opinion at least. You have two standard objects, one called product media, and then you have electronic media group, and then you can see that it connects to electronic media. Now, electronic media is one of those weird connections because it actually connects back into CMS. But you can actually see some of the data in Object Manager here, and other data you can't. So if you go over into your Object Manager and type in media, you can see the product media and the electronic media group, but you can't see the electronic media. Well, that's because it actually lives inside of CMS. So if you wanted to actually see the CMS item, you'd have to go to CMS channels and find the item there. And it's all based off a key structure. So that's one of the reasons I believe why Salesforce has given us the out-of-box media tab right here to make it really easy to add and connect images into CMS, because the objects are a little bit more difficult to deal with because it has to be able to store images and attachment in a very specific way. All right, that wraps it up for products. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into buyers. So buyers are all about the people who are purchasing. So at the very top of this, grouping here, we have our accounts, which are the individuals. And these individuals could be customers, they can be competitors, they could be partners. Accounts are very heavily used inside of Salesforce, and nothing changes with commerce. You can plug into existing accounts here. But where we have some new objects is our contact point address. This allows you to have many different billing, many different shipping addresses associated with one account. So typically you have an out-of-the-box billing and shipping on the account object and record. So they've created a new object here to give you more flexibility as you're checking out, because you routinely will have to add new addresses as the customers are going through. So that's why that is there. Then we have our buyer group, and a buyer group is kind of the top level grouping of people and a specific way to price and show products to them. But then we have our buyer account, which is actually part of the connection back to the account. And there's a little bit more there that we'll show in a second. But then most importantly, we have our contact and user. The contact, of course, rolls up to the account, but then the user record is actually what logs into the storefront, and it's how it is connected back into the account. So with that kind of high level, let's jump into the buyer ERD. All right, our buyer ERD is relatively straightforward here. Again, we have our account, which we have our contact and users. These three objects right here have been around since the beginning of time with Salesforce. Nothing really changes with these. Just one call it is these users aren't full license users. These are community users. So special access to the storefront, special privileges that way. And then we have our contact point address, as I mentioned, but nothing really special or different about that. But then we have our buyer kind of subgrouping that I've mentioned here. We have our buyer group, which again is really important to understand kind of this top level grouping of information about how I share products and how I share prices. You have your buyer group member, which associates to a buyer account, which then in turn associates to an account. So there's a couple of hops here between the account and the buyer group. Now let's hop into Salesforce and see this real quick. This is something that we've gone over again quite a bit, but let's hop into our buyer groups here. And we'll start at the very top here. So we have our premium buyers is one of the ones we've talked through in the past. If you go over into the related tab, you can see it connects into a lot of different places here. But the one that we're going to talk about here for a moment is the buyer group members. And so you can click into that. It'll actually take you to the account. And so that shows you that relationship there, and that underlying buyer account record can actually be seen by going into the buyer account. And you can see that it connects to the account. You can see the type here and all the information about it. Now, the last thing I wanted to do before we ended this video, and then we go into the next video about all the different objects and groupings that we haven't covered yet, is I wanted to start to stitch the three of these together, because I feel like that's really where it starts to get a little bit complicated, but also really where the magic happens. So let's hop over into our All tab here, and you can see at first glance there is a lot of information here, but hopefully the color coding starts to make it make a little more sense. Now, all of these objects are the ones we've talked about before. There are a couple of attachment objects I didn't previously talk about because it didn't make sense until you saw the full picture. So let's start with the buyer section over here. So we have our store, we have all the buyer information we talked about previously, but then we have this connection object called store buyer group. And this is actually what hooks up a buyer group into a store. So I've bolded these lines right here to show you that this is where the different groupings bridge together. So we have this junction object that says this buyer, the premium one we just looked at, for instance, is connected to the Tiny Homes LWR store. So that's one of the major connections there. And then on the right-hand side, we have all of our product data, and you can see all of the different objects that we were just looking at and talking about. There are a couple of different connection points that are really important here. We'll start at the top here since we were just talking about buyer groups, but we have our price book. So how do we actually connect our price books back into the users and the accounts? Well, that's why we have the buyer group price book object, which is again another junction that allows us to connect the individual price book back to the buyer group. And you can see that if we go back into our premium here, you can see that price book shows up on this list. And that is because of this junction object and record. Now, if we go a little bit closer here and we look at categories and entitlements, we can see we have a new object that wasn't on there previously called entitlement buyer group, which allows us to connect our entitlements to the actual buyer group. So hopping back over into buyer group, you can see that we are seeing one entitlement policy showing up here when we can assign more. So you can actually have more than one on here. So if you go back over here, you can see we can connect many entitlements back to our buyer group. But that's another connection point. And one of the last ones we'll go over today is we have our catalog we've talked about, but we're actually connecting our categories to our catalog. So again, if we go back into our instance and we go over into catalog and into LWR, it actually pops us immediately over into categories. Now, this is a custom Lightning Web component that allows us to see categories very easily, but you can see that that's kind of a correlation here between and a connection between categories and catalog, and why we have this connection on categories back directly to catalog. So at the end of the day here, we have a lot of objects, and we've only talked about 3 different groupings, but hopefully this starts to shed the light on how these data elements are used and also how they're connected together. Now in the next video, we're actually going to go over cart, promotions, and order, and you're going to see this kind of grow even more, probably double in size or more, because there's a lot of data over on that side to capture all the information about what people are purchasing. But I wanted to give one more resource here that I thought was really important. Some of these objects are kind of hard to get to, and they're kind of confusing how they connect onto. You have a couple different utilities. One of those is if you go over into object reference for Salesforce platform in the developer community, all of these objects here are documented with what you can do with them, what special access rules are a part of it, the fields, the types, the properties, the descriptions. So you'll be able to see everything that way. So if you're ever confused about anything, hop over here. You can reference the ERD and pause in different sections and rewatch if that's helpful. And then you can also go into your object manager in Salesforce, or you can go into Workbench to really see how the data shows behind the scenes. Thanks for watching today. Hopefully this was helpful, and stay tuned next week for the video about cart promotion and orders.